Our topic tonight is Big Brother, Blood Money and the Deep State. Please give a warm welcome to our speakers.
I'm going to talk about what I call Australia's cyber military industrial complex, and I want to talk about a lot of the detail about this organism, and I use that word quite deliberately, in its manifestation here in Australia. One of the fascinating things that emerged earlier this year from what we must laboriously call the hacking team hack, which is when an Italian hacking company itself got hacked and the gigabytes of emails were put online, was an insight into the highly lucrative surveillance tool market, particularly what are called zero-day exploits. For those of you who don't know, zero-day exploits are kind of pieces of bespoke code that are developed to target undiscovered or unrepaired vulnerabilities in widely used software and allow the user to get access to computer systems that they shouldn't have access to. Now, tools like zero-day exploits can make enormous amounts of money. We've known that for a long time, but the hacking team hack confirmed it. Zero-day exploits in major operating systems like iOS or major browsers like Chrome could sell for $100,000 US, maybe even $250,000 US each. That's the kind of ballpark of the figure we've known about for a couple of years now. In 2012, an American company guaranteed its customers, and this is a fully fledged, perfectly legitimate industry, complete with guarantees, cashback guarantees for its products. One American company offered 25 zero-day exploits for $2.5 million a year. The sort of numbers that explain why that company successfully raised millions in investment from major US institutions. This is actually an entire industry now. And who spends all this money on these sorts of tools? Why is it so lucrative? Well, we do. We spend the money, taxpayers do, via our security and intelligence agencies. ASIO, via a private sector representative based in my hometown of Canberra, was about to start negotiations with Hacking Team for access to its tools when Hacking Team was exposed. We know that the Australian Federal Police, the Northern Territory Police, the New South Wales Police and Victoria's anti-corruption watchdog had all either been in discussions with Hacking Team or had had contracts with Hacking Team in the past. And in fact, the intelligence and law enforcement agencies of Western governments are the big customers for surveillance tools like zero-day exploits, not organised crime or the ubiquitous and famous Chinese hackers. And of course, ASIO and the Australian Federal Police, and for that matter the CIA and the NSA, they're not buying them in order to go and tell software manufacturers like Apple or Google to go and fix their software because there's a flaw in it. Instead, those agencies are focused on using those tools to break into the computer systems of other governments and companies overseas, and of course, individuals. And it's because Western governments are these days spending so much more money on what is euphemistically called cyber security that the world's biggest defence companies have moved into this space in recent years. These big defence companies like Lockheed or Raytheon or Northrop Grumman, they don't just sell guns and missiles and planes and boats anymore. In recent years, most of them have either developed their own in-house expertise in the area of cybersecurity. I always use that word with air quotes around it because it gives a nice feeling that what it's really about is defending yourself, when in fact so much of it is actually about attacking others via the internet. Cybersecurity has been a growth area of government spending in recent years. After the financial crisis, pretty much every Western government began significantly reducing military spending, particularly the United States, but it also happened in the United Kingdom, also happened here in Australia. Bad news, of course, if you're Northrop or Lockheed or Raytheon. Cybersecurity, on the other hand, was a growth area of spending, and defence companies like growing sources of revenue. So they moved into the whole area of cybersecurity, and that process is actually still going on. It was at the end of 2014 that Raytheon bought one of the most prominent hacking firms in the United States, a company called Blackbird Technologies, for several $100 million. Again, it gives you a kind of a sense of how lucrative this whole area is. So these big defence companies now can offer a full suite of weaponry, from armoured transport to cyberspace, from fighter jets to electronic surveillance. But the thing about these big defence companies is that they don't just supplement the money they make from boats and missiles and jet fighters and guns and things that can blow things up with cybersecurity products. They actually provide a wide range of services and goods to governments. They provide phones and communication services, they provide IT equipment, they provide software, they provide management consultants to run strategic planning sessions, they provide people to provide IT training, they provide security guards. They're deeply embedded in the way that our governments work, not just our defence departments, not just our Army and Navy and Air Force, but many of our agencies right across government. And you have to remember, these are the world's most powerful companies. Lockheed's market capitalisation is now around $65 billion US, which makes it larger than over 100 countries. Between 2011 and 2014, Lockheed spent $58 million lobbying US politicians at the federal level alone. That's not even thinking about what it spent lobbying state politicians in the US. On its board sits a retired US Air Force general, which is really not much to write home about. They're a dime a dozen in the US. But it also has a former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO sitting on its board. In Australia, it's represented by the most influential lobbying firm in the country, the Liberal Party-aligned Barton Deakin. Now, so what, you might ask? Well, Lockheed, of course, is famous for probably one of the biggest bribery scandals in history. It's so large, it's simply called the Lockheed scandal. In the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, involving tens of millions of dollars in bribes, back when tens of millions of dollars was a lot of money, for Western governments in Japan. Lockheed, of course, is responsible for the F-35 jet fighter. That's the plane that can't shoot, can't bomb, can't fly, and can't dogfight, which is now 7 years behind schedule and approaching $400 billion in cost compared to its original budget of $200 billion. Another major US contractor, less well known than Lockheed, is called SAIC, S-A-I-C. It supplies a huge range of services to all kinds of government departments here in Australia and the United States, in addition to its defence revenue. It also provides IT services to our federal parliament. In 2012, SAIC agreed to pay a $500 million fine to the City of New York when it admitted its staff had engaged in criminal conduct in relation to a SAIC contract with the city. $500 million, you've got to say, the Americans do know how to fine people if they ever decide to do it. SAIC's also famous for completing the security system that it had contracted to provide the Greek government for the Athens Olympics in 2004, in 2008, just in time for the Beijing Olympics. And both the National Security Agency and the FBI have written off hundreds of millions of dollars on products that SAIC was supposed to deliver and never did. I call this whole sector the cyber military industrial complex. I know sticking the word cyber in front of things is a little bit passé, and I apologise for it. but for now I think it will do. The cyber military industrial complex is an almost organic entity. One that involves intelligence and defence agencies, private companies, big private companies, the world's biggest private companies, politicians, bureaucrats, cyber security companies, and the people who shuttle between them in the revolving door that is the rule in this sector. Just some local examples. I've already quoted the number of retired uniformed personnel on Lockheed's board, but let's look at the Australian context. 10 out of Raytheon's 16 Australian executives are former ADF or Defence Department personnel or Defence Minister advisors. On Lockheed's Australian board, they've got a local subsidiary with a local board. There's a former Secretary of Defence, there's a former Admiral, and the CEO is a former Senior Navy officer, Defence Attaché and head of the Australian Defence Staff in Washington, which is one of the most crucial military posts in the entire Australian military. That's what I mean when I talk about an organic entity. The organic nature of it is made up by the people who simply cycle through this entire sector. And to give you an indication of the size of this sector in Australia by itself, let me offer you some numbers. This year we've committed to spend $31 billion on defence in Australia, and as part of that we're spending $640 million on defence intelligence. There's actually a specific defence intelligence agency. In fact, there's actually more than one. One of them, as you know, is the Australian Signals Directorate, which does a lot of our signals intelligence gathering, even when it has nothing to do with defence. Some more numbers. Since the 1st of January this year, Lockheed has been awarded $159 million worth of contracts in defence and the Australian Tax Office. Raytheon has scored contracts, Lockheed's a minor player, Raytheon has scored contracts worth $442 million. And not just from defence, they've got contracts with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as well. This goes to my point that these are organisations that don't just provide material for our defence needs, they provide goods and services right across government. From the most anodyne to the most sinister, from surveillance down to lawn mowing. Who mows the lawns on a lot of Australian defence bases? Boeing. Boeing actually has a contract to provide landscaping services for some of our military bases. And then there's ASIO, our domestic intelligence body. They get $400 million a year. And then there's ASIS, our foreign intelligence body. They're the ones who bugged the East Timorese cabinet. This year they're getting $250 million. And then there's the AFP, who devote a lot of their resources to counter-terrorism. They get over $1 billion a year. And a lot of that money flows out of those agencies again to private contractors, to software developers writing zero-day exploits, to the likes of Boeing providing mowing services, to Lockheed and Northrop and Raytheon for missiles and boats and jet fighters, and management consulting services, and software, and IT training. That's not even anywhere near a full list of our intelligence agencies. There's a bunch of others, of course, and there's a new addition to their ranks, a new paramilitary body called Border Force, which has proven a big hit since it was created earlier this year. And then there's nebulous non-bodies as well, like the Australian Cyber Security Centre, which kind of floats in between them all and is made up of people seconded from actual institutions into a kind of virtual institution that doesn't actually have any specific powers and doesn't have any specific legislation, but which, of course, handily means that it doesn't actually have any specific accountability for what it does. Now, of course, we need such agencies with their massive budgets and their draconian powers, which even as we speak are being extended by our government if we're to defend ourselves from the various threats to our national security. At least that's the idea. But there are two problems with that argument. First, the argument that intelligence agencies need extensive powers and massive budgets to fight terrorism. And by the way, the head of ASIO, Duncan Lewis, recently called for still more funding for ASIO, despite the fact that its budget has increased by 600% since 2000. This argument is needed to fight terrorism is somewhat problematic, given that the primary purpose of many of these agencies is actually commercial, not defence, not national security. It was ASIS that bugged the East Timorese cabinet a decade ago in order to give Australia an advantage in negotiations in the boundary dispute with East Timor. It was the Australian Signals Directorate that bugged Indonesian trade negotiators who were in dispute with the United States and of course passed on the information they gleaned to the United States for use by American companies in that trade dispute. It was the Australian Signals Directorate that tried to bug the Indonesian president and his wife and his inner circle. What about the NSA? Well, who were the most prominent targets of the surveillance of the National Security Agency? Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, Francois Hollande, President Dilma Rousseff of Brazil, President Vincent Fox of Mexico. All of them allies, close allies, or at the very worst, friendly states to the United States. And all of them surveillance targets. That's because the surveillance programs used by these security agencies are mainly for commercial purposes. We know they have no benefit in fighting terrorism. That's the conclusion of Barack Obama's own review panel established in the wake of the Snowden revelations. Barack Obama's own review panel found that none of the surveillance engaged in by the National Security Agency was necessary to stop any terrorist attacks. In fact, the only benefit they found for the entire NSA dragnet in all its multi-billion-dollar glory was that they managed to track down one person who had sent some money to a charity that was suspected of having terrorist links. No terrorist attacks halted, no terrorist links found. Just one poor example to justify tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in expenditure and a massive industrial scale, global scale invasion of privacy.
Second, there's the fact that the war on terror is not merely apparently never-ending, but self-perpetuating. In April, the head of the CIA, John Brennan, speaking at Harvard, opened up about the fact that we seem to have made no progress whatsoever in the war on terror. According to Brennan, basically the war is better than doing nothing. Quote, if we're not as engaged against the terrorists, I think we would be facing a horrendous environment, he said. Pressed on why there now appear to be more terror groups than when the US initiated the war on terror after 9/11, Brennan said something most interesting. We have worked collectively as a government, but also with our international partners, very hard to try and root many of them out. Might some of these actions be stimulants to others joining their ranks? Sure, that's a possibility. I think, though, it has taken off the battlefield a lot more terrorists than it has put on. End of quote. So the conduct of the war on terror might have been a stimulant to terrorist recruitment. And in fact, we can see this at work in Syria with Islamic State at the moment, because the bombing campaign against Islamic State has, according to US military sources, actually caused a massive spike in recruitment of foreign fighters travelling to Turkey, our ally Turkey, to cross the border into Syria and join Islamic State.
Such that according to the US military, Islamic State has actually made up all of its losses to US and allied bombs, courtesy of a new influx of foreign fighters. So at the very best, we're kind of equal. We're not taking more off the battlefield than they're putting on. We're kind of maintaining a status quo, which is good if you actually want the war on terror to go forever. Because the likes of Tony Abbott, the now departed, sadly, Tony Abbott, and Bill Shorten, following the lead of George W. Bush, have always maintained that terrorism had nothing to do with our actions. That these people merely hate us for our freedoms. To which it seems the bipartisan response is to curb those very freedoms that are hated so much. But Brennan has directly contradicted that. It's interesting hearing Julie Bishop speaking at the Sydney Institute earlier this year, talking about how Islamic State was literally the greatest threat ever in the history of civilization, beyond even the Soviet Union, which could have annihilated the entire world with its nuclear weapons. But she offered a fascinating account of the development of Islamic State, which seemed to pretend that the Iraq War never happened. She blamed the Arab Spring. She said the whole thing had erupted out of the Arab Spring and had nothing to do, she didn't even mention the invasion of Iraq as a cause of the development of the Islamic State and as a key training ground for many of the top leaders of Islamic State. It was as if the Iraq War version 2, I think, as it was, never actually happened, as an explainer for why we're currently engaged in the Iraq War version 3. But anyway, John Brennan has completely discredited that. He's openly admitted that we are stimulating onto the battlefield terrorists. And moreover, what he said was actually not in any way exceptionable in intelligence circles. The CIA has in the past acknowledged that the Iraq War caused a surge in terrorist action in the West. MI6, the former head of MI6, in her evidence to the Chilcot inquiry in the United Kingdom, which we still haven't seen yet. We're still waiting for that after many, many years to find out what the official explanation for why the Blair government went into the Iraq War. But the former head of MI6 acknowledged that in the context of the London bombings, the actions of the United Kingdom had stimulated terrorism. Even our own former Australian Federal Police Commissioner Mick Kelty, in the aftermath of the Madrid bombings, linked our role in Iraq with a rise in terrorism. And for his sins, he was savaged by the Howard government for saying exactly that. But I think it's quite undeniable. Certainly if you believe the head of the CIA and the head of most of our intelligence agencies and a former head of our significant law enforcement body, that even apart from the extent to which US armaments and vehicles given to the Iraqi army found their way to Islamic State, and quite apart from the way that US trained and armed rebels in Syria have defected to Al-Qaeda or to Islamic State, we ourselves are perpetuating the war on terror by creating new generations of terrorists with military interventions and another topic that I haven't included here but which is equally relevant, drone strikes. And who benefits from this endless self-perpetuating war on terror? Well, as I've already mentioned, ASIO's budget has increased significantly since 2001. The United States has spent $500 billion on intelligence between 9/11 and 2013. $500 billion. Britain's intelligence budget has increased 2.5 times in that period. It's actually very hard to get details about the British intelligence budget because if you go and look at the reports of the Intelligence Committee that oversees them, there's always asterisks where the numbers should be. So you can only get a kind of global sense, but it's certainly the case that the intelligence budget in Britain has also massively increased over the last decade and a bit. So plainly our security bureaucrats who face virtually no accountability for their budgets do very, very well out of the war on terror. But others do so as well. Since Barack Obama announced airstrikes against Islamic State in August last year, the share price of Lockheed has risen 25%, while the Nasdaq has only risen 10%. Lockheed's share price has hit record highs, historical record highs, higher than it has ever been in its entire history, dozens of times in the 13 months since then. Raytheon's share price, well, hasn't done quite as well. It's only up 16%, but it's also recorded dozens of record highs. And Northrop's share price, well, if you've got shares in Northrop, you've done extraordinarily well because Northrop's share price is up 39% in that period and it has hit record highs over 100 times. Its market capitalisation has increased from 22.6 billion or thereabouts to 31.4 billion, all since the latest iteration of the war in Iraq was announced. So with that sort of money, well, who wouldn't want the war on terror to last, as so many intelligence figures say it will, for decades to come? Thank you.